A 102-year-old airline, no crash, no scandal, no bankruptcy filing, and over a single weekend in February 2022, the entire reason it existed stopped existing because of a decision made about something else entirely, more than 1,000 miles away. That was Finnair. 4 years on, it survives partly by renting its aircraft to rivals, and this October, it starts flying to Australia the long way round, through Bangkok. So how does a line on a map gut a company that did nothing wrong? Why was the best-placed airline in Europe also the most fragile one on the continent? And is a geographic advantage ever really yours? Start with the map. Finland sits in the top right corner of Europe, and for most of the 20th century that was a problem. A country of 5.6 million people has a domestic market far too thin to build a major airline on. When consul Bruno Lucander founded the company as Aero on November 1st, 1923, it spent its first year carrying 269 passengers in a Junkers seaplane between Helsinki and Tallinn. But look at a globe instead of a flat map, and the picture inverts. The shortest path from Western Europe to Tokyo, Seoul, or Shanghai does not run east across the continent. It runs north over the curve of the planet, and it passes almost directly over Helsinki. Finnair spent 4 decades learning how to sell that single fact. In April 1983, it became the first airline to fly non-stop from Western Europe to Japan, using a modified DC-10 fitted with 12,048 liters of extra fuel tanks so it could cross the North Pole and the Bering Strait. It went over the top of the world because it had no way through the middle. Soviet airspace was shut to it. That flight took 13.5 hours, the long way round, because there was no short way. Then, in 1994, the door opened. Finnair won access to Russian airspace, and the same journey to Tokyo collapsed to roughly 9 hours. Helsinki stopped being a remote northern outpost and became the shortest corridor between two of the wealthiest travel markets on Earth. What Finnair built on top of that corridor is what made the collapse so total. Now look carefully at what Finnair actually owned. It owned aircraft, and eventually 17 Airbus A350s, having been the European launch customer for the type. It owned slots, a brand, a hub, 100 years of engineering. What it did not own was the one thing the entire business rested on. Overflight rights are permissions, granted state to state and revocable at will. Finnair ran roughly 80 routes a week through Russian airspace on the strength of a bilateral agreement, and an agreement is not an asset. It is a door somebody else is holding open for you. Nobody in Helsinki treated it that way. The airline set a formal target of doubling its Asian traffic from a 2010 baseline, pulled the deadline forward when it started beating the plan, and aimed at 20 million passengers a year by 2030. And the country built around the strategy. Between 2013 and 2023, the airport operator Finavia poured more than €1 billion into Helsinki Airport, expanding the terminal floor area by 45% and rebuilding the whole thing under one roof to move 30 million passengers a year, most of whom would never leave the building. Here is the detail that shows how deep the commitment ran. Helsinki is the only airport in Europe with transfer signage in English plus Mandarin, Korean, Japanese, and Russian. A nation of 5.6 million had rebuilt its front door for travelers from 4 other languages who were only passing through. By every conventional measure, this was excellent strategy. It was also a single point of failure that nobody had put a price on, and the price was about to be set by people who had never given Finnair a moment's thought. Then, across 3 days in February 2022, the door swung shut. Russia invaded Ukraine on the 24th. Over that weekend, the European Union closed its own airspace to all Russian aircraft as a sanction, a coordinated decision by 27 governments aimed squarely at Moscow. On February 28, Russia answered in kind and barred airlines from 36 European countries from its skies. And this is the detail that defines the whole story. Nobody was aiming at Finland. The sanction was Europe's. The retaliation was blanket. Finnair simply happened to be the European airline standing closest to the door when it slammed. The market worked it out inside a morning. European airline and airport shares fell 3 to 6% that week. Finnair's fell 21%. Within hours, the company began began cancelling the routes it had spent 40 years assembling: Seoul, Osaka, Tokyo, Shanghai, and Guangzhou, along with every flight to Moscow and St. Petersburg. Chief Executive Topi Manor put it in the flattest possible language, saying that without Russian airspace, the operation of most of Finnair's passenger and cargo flights to Asia was not economically sustainable or competitive, not unprofitable, not difficult, not sustainable. 6 months later, at a strategy briefing on September 7, 2022, Manor said the sentence that belongs on the wall of every business school: "We do not have a unique geographical advantage anymore, but the company still had one asset left that nobody had thought to count. It would hold Finnair together for 3 years, and then it would detonate." So how does a border on the ground empty a company in the air? Great circle geometry is the entire answer. On a sphere, the shortest line between Helsinki and Tokyo is a curve that runs across Siberia. Take that corridor away and only 2 options remain, both bad: climb north over the pole or swing south around the whole Russian landmass. Finnair's block time to Tokyo Narita had been about 10 hours. When it restarted the route on March 9, 2022, the schedule read 13. Across Japan and South Korea, the airline now puts the penalty at 2 to 4 hours each way, and describes some Asian routings as up to 40% longer than before 2022. And here is where the mechanism clicks into place. Those extra hours do not simply cost fuel. They cost aircraft, because a jet spending 6 more hours in the air each day completes fewer rotations a week. They cost crew, because longer sectors burn duty hours and sometimes demand an extra pilot. They cost cargo, because fuel loaded is payload not loaded. And they cost reach, because Finnair's 8 A330s could no longer make some of the destinations they had been bought to serve, becoming, in the company's own careful phrasing, range limited. The advantage was never the flight time itself. It was the margin the flight time created. Erase 2 hours and the aircraft, the crew, the fuel and the freight are all still on the balance sheet. The profit is the only thing missing. Finnair lost €381.4 million in the first half of 2022 alone and closed the year with an operating loss of €200.6 million. Its Asian capacity fell to 40% of 2019 levels. In April 2022, the Finnish state converted a €400 million pandemic loan into equity, and the government's own statement named the cause without flinching. Russia's military actions and the resulting sanctions and counter-sanctions had blocked Finnair's Asia strategy. A rule written in Brussels to punish Moscow emptied a company in Helsinki. What Finnair did next kept it breathing. It also cost the airline something it has not got back. The improvisation that followed got genuinely strange. The first move was to turn the airline around. If Asia had become expensive, the Atlantic was cheap by comparison, and Finnair pushed west hard. North American capacity ran at 165% of 2019 levels in 2022, with Dallas-Fort Worth and Seattle added, then Chicago, Los Angeles and Toronto this summer. It signed a cooperation deal with Qatar Airways in August 2022 and started flying Nordic capitals to Doha on the Gulf carrier's behalf. It shut its Stockholm base. It replaced its own domestic flights to Tampere and Turku with buses. And then there was that uncounted asset. Finnair had a wide-body fleet it could no longer fully use and crews trained to fly it. At the exact moment, other airlines were emerging from the pandemic desperately short of both. So the flag carrier became a landlord. 4 A320s went to British Airways for European flying. In May 2023, it agreed to lease 2 A330s to Qantas with crews included, working Sydney to Singapore and Sydney to Bangkok, rolling into a dry lease afterwards. A stranded fleet had been turned into rent. Then it blew up. In December 2024, Finnair's pilots' union opened a dispute over standby duties on exactly those leased operations. Talks failed. By April 2025, the airline had cut the Qantas arrangement back to 1 aircraft on 1 route and furloughed 36 pilots. The lifeboat had a hole in it. 4 years of improvisation had kept the company alive without giving it back a reason to exist. So who is carrying those passengers now? And has any of this actually been repaired? Look at who won, because the answer is uncomfortable. The routes did not vanish. The demand did not vanish, only the passports changed. Chinese carriers were never barred from Russian airspace and still cross it, with Air China, China Eastern and China Southern flying the same corridor Finnair is locked out of, burning less fuel on shorter blocks at lower cost. In 2019, Chinese airlines held about 55% of seat capacity between China and Europe. Through 2025, they held roughly 77%. That single pair of numbers is the whole argument. Identical geography, opposite outcomes, decided entirely by which government issued the operating certificate. For summer 2026, Chinese carriers are adding a net 2,891 flights to Europe, Air China alone contributing 1,120 of them. One of the new services is Beijing-Daxing to Helsinki, a Chinese airline using the corridor over Russia to fly into Finnair's own hub, which brings us to the cruelest line in the whole account. In the autumn of 2023, Finavia finished the job. The billion-euro Helsinki airport program was completed on schedule, 45% more terminal, capacity for 30 million passengers, signage in 5 languages. Finland finished building the perfect connecting airport roughly 18 months after the connection it was built for had been cancelled, and the carriers now best placed to fill it are the ones flying in from Beijing. Europe has noticed. Lufthansa chief executive Carsten Spohr has called for every airline landing in Europe to be required to avoid Russian airspace, with executives at Air France-KLM, British Airways and SAS backing him. And in 2025, American regulators floated restricting Chinese carriers that overfly Russia on US routes. The airline that lost its shortcut cannot get it back, so the industry is lobbying to take everybody else's away. Finnair itself is not finished. It posted a record net profit of 254.3 million euros in 2023, and although 2025 was thinner at 60.1 million in comparable operating result and 18.4 million net, it is guiding to between 120 and 190 million for 2026, with Asian revenue up 20.1% in the first quarter. But the shape of the company has changed permanently. This October, it opens its first route to Australia, Helsinki to Melbourne in 22 hours and 5 minutes via Bangkok, with the right to sell the Bangkok leg on its own, which returns us to 1983 and a DC-10 with extra tanks crossing the North Pole because there was no way through the middle. The shortcut lasted 28 years from 1994 to 2022. Finnair is not living through the death of a century-old business model. It is living through the end of a brief exception, and it has gone back to flying the long way round exactly as it began. That is the trouble with a moat made of geography. You never actually own the water, somebody else does, and they can drain it in an afternoon. So which companies are sitting on an advantage today that they think they own and are only borrowing? Click here for another one of ours.